this is something that I've been doing in my kind of professional work for a long time, is trying to say, look, these are not technologies of governance that confine themselves to migrants. Like, if you think that this is just, if you think this is just about undocumented migrants, you're missing something massive. B, if you think it's about migrants writ large, you're missing something huge. Because this is really about our relationship with the state and the kind of state that governs us, and the kind of sort of technologically mediated precarity that is being produced now for everyone. When you look at, if you look at the hostile environment as a kind of very crude way, and the tech stuff on the hostile environment, when I say that, I'm talking about the kind of data matching schemes between government departments. Like, this is incredibly crude. This is not high-tech stuff. This is taking some data lists, mashing them together, and then either using that information to say, you're not entitled to this service, or, yep, the Home Office will have your address, thanks, and we'll use that to enforce against you. It's not high-tech stuff. But what we're getting towards is essentially you being assigned some kind of suspect status, and the database is being there to essentially at the click of a button be able to disentitle you from all kinds of things that you need to live and to flourish. And one of the things that we try and point to is that, yes, we've had this with hostile environment and undocumented migrants, but this is the same thing, not the same, but this is a similar thing that's going on with the gangs matrix and with domestic extremists. And when you look at, for example, police sharing data on disabled protesters, right? This is a status that isn't fixed. It's most of them are racialized initially, but they're not going to be confined in that way. So I think one of the things actually where we've discussed undocumented migrants and undocumented migrant kind of mobilization, we've mainly discussed that in terms of things that are badged as explicitly political. So kind of the manifestos and demands that women in Yarlswood produced when they went on hunger strike, for example. I think we've not really done so much of the discussion of, is just living with an undocumented status a radical act, etc. But I think in part that's because we're really trying to get at something about the shape of the state.
That's really helpful. I mean, I think to go back to some of the many things you said, Bridget, that were interesting. I think the concepts we use, I mean, basically I think what you're saying is sometimes that we can romanticize or imply a kind of revolutionary subjectivity to groups who are just, who might not subscribe to that exact, might not meet our demands for kind of being that revolutionary, embodying that revolutionary subject once they've got their stay or whatever. But I do think partly what we're looking for is some hope, and maybe we need some romance around that. And I think there's different ways of doing it, but the reason The Many-Headed Hydra, the book you mentioned, I find so energizing to read is to think about this motley group of multiracial Atlantic revolutionary subjects traveling by, but there's something about them moving, ports, the way in which they interact with each other, and the possibilities of them building other worlds and challenging the system of kind of racial capitalism, colonial ordering of the whole world, and destruction of the planet. There's a chance of them challenging it in the 17th and 18th century or whatever, which is just exciting to read about. And I think sometimes we need that too. And so whether Abolition, No Borders gets you kind of in that space, I think there are various people who write in that way about groups of people whose mobilities are kind of unruly and who explode the categories of kind of identity with which we're fixed by states, whether they're kind of ethnic, racial, class, fixed in space and in law, and they kind of begin to explode them through their own self-organization and sheer creative power. And I think the literature on No Borders, on border abolition, on autonomy of migration, literature by James Scott, who is, sorry to name another academic, but he's a historian, a kind of anarchist historian who writes about, in a book called The Art of Not Being Governed, writes about people, the history of peoples who've basically fled states, whether up mountains or into kind of swamp-like areas, and tries to tell the history of a particular region in South and Central Asia as people fleeing the state and building their own forms of community. So I think there's a link between all of them. Many-Headed Hydra is one of my favorites. I guess I would maybe read it differently, that no borders is better than border abolition on that, because in some ways I think the invocation of the kind of undocumented migrant as the revolutionary subject, I take more from stuff around autonomy of migration, around the kind of moments when people cross, stuff about the mobile commons, all of which I really like. And I suppose when I've read some people talking about prison and police abolition, they talk about the kind of nitty-gritty messiness of trying to get coalitions built, the kinds of Ruthie Gilmore talks about people who aren't committed to prison and police abolition, but do abolitionist work just by their everyday acts of care and other things like that. So I think we're not making the concepts compete, but I think in both you can see the tendency to romanticize and find a revolutionary subject to talk about, the fugitive or the person exploding everything. And then in real life, you find people with complex kinds of identifications that change over time, sometimes in really unremarkable ways where they want their family to come over and to have a house, like lots of us want. And briefly, I guess the other kind of concepts, the other places to think from, I know people who are beginning to write, and I think we have a real problem with when we engage with radical ideas or leftist politics from other places, we tend to only have a couple of people who we read. So if we read about India, then we read Arundhati Roy's essay. If we read about Africa, then we read the handful of people who translate for us. And I think that the kind of histories that we're talking about lead to that kind of epistemic problem or imperialism or whatever. But I do think we should be looking for other ideas that don't just emerge from kind of European left traditions or even North American Black freedom struggles, that give us ideas about movement and identity and freedom. And I think some people talk about that in the African context. And Ashila Mbembe is one of those translators, writes about borderlessness. I realize I'm name dropping, so I'm going to ask someone else to put that in the chat, which is the idea of a borderless future by Ashila Mbembe, which again talks about African cosmologies, etc., and ideas about movement. And there are, people like me like reading about Buddhism and Jewish traditions of kind of here-ness and other things. So there's many things we can look at, but I don't know, Bridget, if we can avoid accidentally getting overly excited about the revolutionary possibilities of some subject we partly create, because actually we're desperately in need of something other than this world of kind of borders and walls and closure.
I suppose I like, I think there's something about that idea that you've just kind of implied, Luke, which is about the ways in which all of our subjectivities are always changing, and that goes as much for, that just goes as much for you and me and the people in this conference as it does for anyone else. And I think if we can appreciate that we've all, there's so much to learn, so much to learn, and so much where we can be radically different and creative. And I think maybe if we just see ourselves also as part of that story. So I really like this, I do really like the phrase world making, because I think that is what we're trying to do. And it's something positive, as you say, it's trying to build a world and build a world together. So so I suppose maybe if we think about these kind of political understandings and subjectivities, always learning from each other, always changing in our very different positions, then that perhaps helps us escape some of that romanticism while still getting some of the energy that we need. Because I do think we were just kind of, I don't think you were there, Gracie, but just before we opened, some people were getting excited about England versus Scotland. And I was saying, I was just sort of made a flippant remark, nationalised subjectivities in action. And it was kind of a flippant remark, but I think what it shows is that we have a need for emotion, right? I mean, there is a need, and in a way, I think, and again, this was something that somebody commented on the conference I was last at, we do, that maybe the national also, and I think this is correct, fulfills, and the reason the national and nationalism can have such attraction is in part because of its strong affective component. And actually, ideas of solidarity, of commonality. You know, we get, as well as being political, as well as being kind of political aims, they are also, they give us emotional strength. They also, I think, name emotions. And I wonder whether we should be kind of thinking more about emotion as well, thinking more about emotion in the work that we're doing, as well as, you know, as well as our kind of political, and it's, or no, it's not as well as, it's recognizing the importance of emotion, you know, and also like care, Gracie, that you mentioned in our political work, whether we should be doing more kind of foregrounding of that in our political work. And then the other thing I was just thinking is then thinking about different changing subjectivities. So I joked in the in my bio about the terrible title of my first book, which I feel like I've just come out and said, okay, this was what it was called, and it's a crap name. It's a politically really problematic name. But I think that, you know, if I look at myself when I first came to this field, I think I was probably, you know, a sort of humanitarian kind of type, really. And I went through a journey, and sometimes, to use a sort of cringeworthy analogy, but I kind of sometimes think that because there is, you know, and I really get the critiques of humanitarianism, absolutely, and the problems of humanitarianism, which I've kind of been struggling a lot in my own work against trafficking. But I just sometimes also concerned that because we can be very allergic to the problems of humanitarianism, which captures the problems of reformist reforms, right? That actually we can kind of cut off a whole load of people that actually maybe we should be working more to convince, or maybe we should be kind of like, yeah, opening things up rather than thinking like, so again, this is just my sense very much from the outside, because I'm much less politically involved than I should be, or I used to be, but that's kind of some of the sense, that's maybe I'm wrong, but that's kind of some of the sense that I get from the ways that politics are moving. So as we're getting more politicized and energized around abolition and no borders, maybe we're leaving some people behind, and maybe we just have to leave them behind, I don't know, but where we could be picking up people along the way. I don't know.
But that's interesting, because to me, that's exactly part of, and again, you might think No Borders does this, but, you know, for me, and actually, I think it was Sita who said it, Sita Balani, in one of the, I can't remember, one of the many panels that were happened about abolition in the summer, but, you know, offering a way between revolution and reform. So I actually think that's exactly what part of what we want to do with the book is actually to, you know, I'm sort of thinking about all of the people I've met in my professional work. And I'm like, you know, look, if somebody would actually do the work of, you know, we could have a conversation about it. Like, the point is, I get tired of having those conversations, you know, after a while, they kind of drive you up the wall. But like, you can see that people are not necessarily kind of irredeemably allergic to some of the stuff that we believe in. It's, you know, sometimes, you know, there's a kind of caricature, or like, I had this really interesting, it wasn't interesting, it drove me mad at the time because she was my boss, but it was when Luke and I first started writing the book, and she was like, you're writing a book on this? Borders are essential for democracy. And I was just like, I didn't even know that that's what people thought. Like, but actually, when you get over that and the fact that it's your boss, you're like, well, okay, so we can work with that. So I actually think that part of what we want to, one of the audiences for the book are those kind of policy people and some of those humanitarians, of which I absolutely was one. You know, I was doing my master's at LSE, and I was like, I did languages. I just want to, you know, go and work wherever. You know, and then I did David Keene's managing humanitarianism class, and I was like, damn, I'm stuck in this country. Like, you know, so I've absolutely been there. But I think those are absolutely some of the people that we want to talk to, and who we want to prompt to maybe think about some of this stuff and hash out some of those kind of, oh, okay, maybe we're not. One of the things that I've seen in my professional work is a kind of total aversion to even having the conversation. And, you know, I work in spaces where there are lots of lawyers, and obviously lawyers do some great things. It is mainly lawyers I've seen who shut those things down in advocacy. They're like, oh, we don't need to talk about that. We just want to get this one thing done. But I think actually there is space to start to have some of those conversations. And I think when Luke and I talked about the kind of that political flowering, I certainly was not talking about maybe Jeremy Corbyn will be the Prime Minister. It was more that kind of some of the rhetorical space is opening up. Like there are conversations that I'm having even at work that wouldn't have happened before. And so I think it's absolutely, I think because abolitionist organising with its emphasis on the coalition, and, obviously Ruthie Gilmore talks about, coalition of environmentalists and prison abolitionists and so many others in organising against particular facilities in California. I think that bringing people in and actually committing to having some of those conversations is absolutely part of, I think it's really important. And I think it's something that we actually want to support we wonder if the book will be helpful with that. It really might not be, but I think it's part of what we were hoping.
Yeah, I'll pick up on a couple of those things. I think you're right that the national works because of the effective component, and for my sins been reading a bit about fascism and what fascism is and theories around fascism, but broadly all ultranationalism partly has its appeal to your emotions because it says you're not just an individual in this isolated world or a unit of labor power, that you're part of a wider project or wider collective, wider community, which can be made stronger and your life made more meaningful through purifying itself of various enemies, minorities, traitors. And we know where that leads. And I think the question does have to be for us, how do we cultivate other kinds of collectivity in which we're emotionally invested? And I think all sorts of communities do that in radical ways. I mean, there's no surprise that kind of queer activism and no borders activism are deeply connected. I think it comes back to my point broadly about why we need the hope and we need to kind of be invested in these stories, especially in our digitally isolated and mediated understanding of the world. So when people in Glasgow, stop the raid, everyone is so animated and so excited, and people need that. And there's an opening out there of a possibility of another kind of world where that group of people who stop a thing happening on the street like that show a different version of emotional investment in a collective unit of some kind, often at the level of the city, perhaps at the level of the cosmos. It does both at the same time. And I think there's a bunch of people who I name dropped who are trying to reach for that, whether that's the many-headed hydra or other kinds of concepts for conviviality, but ideas about collectivity that give us hope. So I think that is what No Borders and Border Abolition and other groups are trying to do, actually, is trying to kind of sketch out. And even those who overinvest in the revolutionary undocumented migrant, subject of the undocumented migrant, are trying to say these forms of investment in collectivity could stem the tide of nationalist, fascist moves. And the only thing I'd ask back about the humanitarian impulse, I agree that there's something that can be salvaged. I agree that when Europe, and this is kind of the tragedy of it, when many people in Europe see certain images of death in the Mediterranean, that their response is deeply emotional and is very humane in its impulse, not for everyone, but for a lot of people. The real thing that's so difficult and so tragic is that then that gets manipulated. So I think we need to distinguish between the humanitarian impulse, which I don't think is necessarily reformist, and the ways in which it's used, so that your humanitarian impulses, your idea that, this shouldn't be happening, that people shouldn't be drowning, is manipulated into, well, we need to stop the boats to save the lives. We need to stop the traffickers, and all of the discourse that you've written about, Bridget, and that other people work on about, the need to police trafficking, the need to stop people being enslaved. All of that is to actually work from the thing that is a kind of kernel of care and possibility into the demand for more police, more surveillance, more drones over the sea, more development programs that apparently will stop people moving. So, and I guess that's the other thing about immigration control that we should always note, is that there's always that kind of morality play at the heart of it. There's always every political speech from any party starts with, we have a long tradition of welcoming refugees and yada, yada, yada. But that's because the conceits of a liberal state in particular rely on saying we do care, we are fair, we are reasonable. But what we actually need to do is, I don't know, send in the immigration enforcement to the place where people are working in various kinds and put them in detention center and deport them. But you don't see that. You just see the argument that this is a rational, fair system that is kind of mobilized by care. And that's the thing that really is difficult and upsetting, and makes kind of thinking through the narratives on trafficking and slavery especially fraught, because you end up with people who actually are potential comrades in a way, who've come to it from a different angle. And I think people who've been working on sex worker rights and other things will know about this struggle. I actually really enjoyed Revolting Prostitutes, the book, and thought that was a really good way of trying to say this is not just a radical manifesto which speaks to people who are already on side. It kind of said, there's people are on the move, people can be shifted, and this is an attempt to show them why they should move with us.
Well, I suppose the thing is, care is also about power, isn't it? You can't, just because it's, just because you care doesn't mean that you can kind of like extricate yourself from these kind of power questions. I was just listening to, I read a really interesting paper yesterday, which was talking about the Palatines, who were basically like the Huguenots, but fleeing from, I think, Rhineland, but basically, and tried to come to England. But, because, there's this rhetoric about, we're welcoming them since the Huguenots and yada, yada. But of course, the Huguenots were highly skilled and quite wealthy. The Palatines were not skilled and not wealthy. So they were not welcome. And they were shipped off to the United States, what became the United States. And they weren't actually allowed to come to England. So I think that was like, wow, that's really interesting. But yeah, just to kind of sort of like contradict myself, or sort of like give the sort of like the converse of what I was just saying about kind of humanitarianism. I mean, so firstly, there's the thing about care and power, and then there's also, the problem of victimhood and the politics of victimhood, and sort of always endlessly kind of relying on that politics, which is, I think, kind of, a real humanitarian trap. I think that when we see that happening, we know we're going nowhere. And obviously we haven't talked about race and how that figures in all of these conversations, but I know you guys know it's there. And I'd also the other thing that we haven't talked about, and it was interesting, Luke, that you talked about investing in the figure. I was thinking like, oh, there's a capitalist word. And there's a word that is interesting also because it's about the future. And I do think that one of the great things about movements that, again, I think have changed, and maybe they haven't changed, maybe it's just the circles that I've moved in have changed, but is actually the kind of prefigurative politics, and actually making it now and not something that we're investing in for the future, because that's also where I think we can get some of our energy from.
Luke, I'm sure you've got something to say about this. Well, yeah, because actually I'm about to say something that's a digression as usual. So come on, Luke, before I derail us.
I'm realising we haven't got, I'm going to look at Joel for affirmation, but I'm realising we've only got a couple of minutes because we've got to be quite strict with 2 minutes. So I mean, I wasn't going to say anything. I was just hoping you were going to say something beautiful and epic about prefigurative, hopeful, radical abolitionist politics. But I mean, I would say that broadly, as we close out, I think one of the reasons we reached for abolition, and this is not at the exclusion of any other frame, is because of the energy, and all the panels you talk about, Gracie, are also that energy of people who really do want to change everything. And the terms we use can change over time. Different words animate us, and different words we organize around temporarily at different periods. But I think what was really appealing about abolition was the idea that you can imagine, you can say that the only acceptable and livable future is one without bordered nation states. And then from that vision and from that hope, and from all of that radical energy, you can still think about how to prefigure that now in ways of caring for one another, in all of the things we described about exploding state identity categories, etc. And looking after one another, and all of the things that people in places like the Unity Centre and SDS do. And I'm not naming as many groups as I should, but also be oriented to a kind of practical politics now and some things that we can do. And I think it was that, yeah, it's non-reformist reforms. Yes, it's an organising tool, but it's also always one which doesn't shy away from saying, you know, there's joy and care and love, and that is actually at the root of what we mean when we say we're you know, anti-capitalist, left-wing, whatever word you use, is that there's kind of love underneath it all, and hope and possibility, and that is in being invested in a future, not in just the end of the world coming, and we'll analyze our way towards the end of everything and the apocalyptic forms of theory that are also gaining some traction in this time. So yeah, that's not an epic way to end. Some attempt to say something about prefiguration. Gracie, I don't know if you've got anything to add about why we...
Yeah, I mean, I guess just for me as well, there's something about where if you know, there will be people here who work in NGOs, and who work at the kind of coalface of looking down the barrel of electoral politics and so on, and like have to do media and have to think about, you know, when's this 18-month campaign going to reach its relatively tiny attempted tweak and so on. And I just really, there's just something kind of that I find very hopeful and kind of relieving about this idea that we're working towards changes in the here and now, like things that we actually may manage to achieve, and ways of being that, you know, that we can just be certain ways with each other. But at the same time, we're opening the way up for things that we just maybe aren't ever going to see, and someone else is going to pick up the baton. And, you know, there are things that we will live to see, and there are things that we won't, and kind of, you know, there's only so much that we're going to get done in the tiny lives that we lead. And I think, you know, I think I'm just quite philosophical about these things. And I think it just kind of really, in some ways, sort of, it takes the pressure off, but also it's motivating, because you're not necessarily going for something that appears to be completely impossible. And so I suppose, just to conclude, one of the things that we wanted to do with the book as well is just sort of counter this sort of relentless psychological disciplining that I think particularly those of us that are relatively young have grown up with, this, and this kind of, you can't have this, you have to go for what's sensible, you have to go for what's reasonable, you can't go for what people actually need to flourish, you have to go for what people will vote for, or what the focus groups are saying. And I just think that, and, you know, Luke is right, that, you know, it's not, there are many different frames that could have helped us towards this, but I think for me, abolition has just been really beautiful in helping to see a way out of that.
Thank you, Luke, Gracie, and Bridget, for an energizing, really interesting opening remarks and discussion. And now to everyone here. Next, we have 2 parallel sessions. Yes, so against the academic industrial complex, which was and is by Zoom registration only, and the Abolition Frontex workshop, which is not capped. So I encourage everyone to stay with us for the next sessions. Thank you.
Recording stopped.